Sam's legs trembled as he stood frozen at the bottom of the cellar steps, his 8-year-old mind struggling to process what lay before him in the dim shaft of sunlight filtering through the door above. The woman was real, not a shadow or trick of light, but flesh and blood, her dark hair matted and streaked with premature grey. She sat slumped against a thick wooden post, iron shackles around her wrists that had worn smooth grooves in the wood from years of use. "Samuel," she whispered again, her voice cracked from disuse. "You look just like your father did at your age." The boy's mouth moved soundlessly. Nobody had spoken his father's name in years. David Carter had died when Sam was barely 2, along with his mother, in that terrible car accident on the mountain road. Grandfather never talked about them, said it hurt too much to remember. "Who are you?" Sam finally managed, his voice barely audible. The woman's eyes, deep blue like his own, filled with tears that carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "I'm your grandmother, Samuel, your father's mother. My name is Eleanor." The world tilted sideways. Grandmother Eleanor had died giving birth to his father. Grandfather had told him the story countless times, how the love of his life had slipped away in the birthing bed, leaving him to raise David alone. There was even a headstone in the Millfield cemetery with wilted flowers that Grandfather replaced every Sunday after church. "That's not possible," Sam whispered, backing toward the stairs. "You're dead. Grandfather showed me your grave." Eleanor's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Death would have been kinder. She lifted her shackled hands, the chains clanking softly. "He's kept me here since 1932, Samuel. 20 years of darkness and silence, except when he comes to—" Her voice broke, unable to finish. Sam's mind reeled. 1932 was the year his father was born, the year Grandfather claimed his beloved wife had died. But if this woman was telling the truth, if she really was Eleanor Carter, then everything Sam knew about his family was built on lies. "I don't understand," he said, hot tears stinging his eyes. "Grandfather is good. He helps people. He's the sheriff." "He's a monster wearing a badge," Eleanor said gently, seeing the boy's confusion. "But not to you, I know. Ezra can be kind when it serves him. He loves you, Samuel, in his own twisted way, just like he once loved me before I learned what he really was." The cellar seemed to spin around Sam as fragments of memory crashed together in new patterns. The night's Grandfather disappeared for hours, claiming sheriff business, the way certain families in town avoided eye contact when they passed the Carter ranch. The locked room in the basement of the jail that Grandfather said was just storage. And the women, he'd overheard hushed conversations about women who'd vanished over the years, but Grandfather always said they'd simply moved on, seeking better lives elsewhere. "Mary Hutchins," Eleanor whispered, watching realization dawn in Sam's eyes. "Rebecca Torres, Sarah McKinnon. I knew them all, Samuel. They came here first to this cellar before—" She shuddered. "Some fought harder than others, some lasted longer, but I'm the only one he couldn't bear to kill." Sam's stomach lurched. Mary Hutchins had been his schoolteacher 2 years ago, a pretty young woman fresh from Helena who disappeared one October night. Sheriff Carter had organized search parties, comforted her grieving parents, promised justice that never came. "The crying," Sam said suddenly. "I heard crying from upstairs." Eleanor nodded sadly. "I knew you'd come eventually. You're just like your father was, curious, brave, unable to ignore suffering. David used to bring me scraps of food when Ezra wasn't watching. That's how I knew him, how I knew about you after he grew up and married your mother." "Father knew about you?" "He was going to expose Ezra," Eleanor said, fresh tears flowing. "Your mother had convinced him to go to the state police. They were planning to leave town right after you were born, start fresh somewhere safe." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That car accident wasn't an accident, Samuel." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. He gripped the cellar wall for support as his world crumbled completely. His parents murdered, his beloved grandfather a killer, his entire life built on a foundation of lies and blood. From somewhere above came the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching, grandfather returning from town earlier than expected. Eleanor's eyes went wide with terror. "Go," she urged desperately. "Lock the door, pretend you were never here. If he knows you found me—" But Sam was already moving, his small hands shaking as he fumbled with the heavy padlock. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by grandfather's familiar whistle, that same cheerful tune he hummed while making Sam breakfast every morning. As the lock clicked shut, Sam heard his grandfather call out from the barn above, "Samuel, where are you, boy?" The monsters we fear most, Sam realized with crystalline clarity, do indeed wear the faces we love best. Sam's heart hammered against his ribs as he scrambled up from the cellar, his boots slipping on the worn wooden steps. The padlock felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hands, but somehow he managed to snap it shut just as grandfather's voice echoed through the barn again, closer now. "There you are." Sheriff Ezra Carter's weathered face appeared in the barn doorway, backlit by the harsh August sun. At 63, he still cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and kind grey eyes that crinkled when he smiled. The same eyes Sam saw in the mirror each morning, the same eyes that had watched him learn to ride, taught him to whittle, dried his tears after nightmares. The same eyes that belonged to a monster. "I was just looking around," Sam managed, shoving his hands deep in his pockets to hide their shaking. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thin and guilty. Grandfather's smile was warm as summer honey. "Course you were, boy. Can't blame a young man for being curious." He ruffled Sam's hair with a calloused hand that had once been Sam's greatest source of comfort. Now that same touch made his skin crawl. "Find anything interesting down there in that old root cellar?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sam's mouth went dry as dust. Just old jars and cobwebs, nothing much." "Good thing," grandfather chuckled, but something flickered behind his eyes. Was it relief? Suspicion? Sam couldn't tell anymore. Everything felt different now, like looking at the world through warped glass. That old cellar's been sealed up for years, probably full of black widows and worse by now. Sam nodded mutely, not trusting his voice. Below their feet, separated by mere inches of rotting floorboards, his grandmother sat chained in darkness. The woman who should have braided his hair and told him bedtime stories and baked him cookies on rainy afternoons. Instead, she'd spent 20 years as a prisoner while he'd grown up believing lies. "Come on then," grandfather said, slinging his arm around Sam's shoulders. The weight of it felt crushing now. "Mrs. Henderson sent over a fresh apple pie this morning. What do you say we cut into it?" They walked toward the house together, just as they had countless times before. But now Sam noticed things he'd never seen, how grandfather's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert as a predator, how his hand never strayed far from the Colt revolver at his hip, how the neighboring families they passed on the road dropped their gazes and hurried their children along. The Carter Ranch stretched across 500 acres of prime Montana grazing land, handed down through 3 generations. Sam had always felt proud of their legacy, the way folks in town tipped their hats to grandfather and called him sheriff with respect. Now he wondered how many secrets lay buried in their pastures, how many families grieved losses they couldn't understand. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, grandfather hummed that same cheerful tune while cutting generous slices of pie. Sam sat at the worn oak table where he'd eaten thousands of meals, staring at the framed photograph of his parents that watched over them from the mantelpiece. David and Margaret Carter on their wedding day, young and radiant with hope for their future together. A future grandfather had stolen from them. "You're mighty quiet today," grandfather observed, sliding a plate across the table. "Everything all right, son?" Son. The word hit like a slap. Sam wasn't his son, wasn't even his grandson by blood, since Eleanor was still alive. He was something else entirely, a witness, a loose end, a problem to be managed. "Just tired, I guess," Sam mumbled, forcing himself to take a bite of pie. It tasted like sawdust and ashes. "Well, eat up. Mrs. Patterson's coming by this afternoon to discuss the church social. She'll want to see you looking healthy and strong." Grandfather's voice carried that familiar note of pride. "Got to maintain the family reputation, you know." Family reputation. Sam almost choked on the words. Their reputation was built on murder and lies, maintained by a badge and a friendly smile. How many people in Millfield knew the truth? How many suspected but stayed silent out of fear? After lunch, Sam retreated to his bedroom under the eaves, claiming he wanted to read. Instead, he sat by the window overlooking the barn, watching for any sign of movement. From here, he could see the weathered structure that had sheltered livestock for a century, and hidden horrors just as long. His entire world had been contained within these boundaries: the ranch, the town, the endless sky above Montana's rolling hills. It had felt safe, predictable, filled with simple pleasures like fishing in Miller's Creek and helping with the cattle drives. Now those same boundaries felt like prison walls, trapping him with terrible knowledge he couldn't escape. As evening shadows lengthened across the yard, Sam made a decision that would haunt him forever. He couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't go back to the innocent boy who'd awakened that morning believing his grandfather was a hero. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between the only family he'd ever known and the woman who sang lullabies in the darkness below. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight streamed through Sam's bedroom window, painting golden rectangles across the pine floorboards where he'd played with toy soldiers just days ago, toy soldiers that now seemed like bitter mockeries of heroism. Below in the kitchen, he could hear the familiar sounds of grandfather preparing breakfast, the scrape of the cast-iron skillet, the whistle of the coffee pot, the rustle of newspaper pages turning. Sam lay motionless under his quilt, staring at water stains on the ceiling that had always reminded him of cloud shapes. Now they looked like something else entirely, like the outline of shackles, like the shadow of bars. His stomach churned with a sickness that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the weight of secrets pressing down on his chest like stones. "Samuel!" Grandfather's voice carried up the stairs, warm and cheerful. "Breakfast is getting cold, boy." The same voice that had read him bedtime stories. The same voice that had probably whispered threats to the women in the cellar. Sam forced himself to dress and descend the narrow staircase, each step feeling like a journey into enemy territory. Grandfather stood at the stove, his back turned, humming that infernal tune while scrambling eggs. The sheriff's badge glinted on his chest, catching the morning light like a broken promise. "There's my early bird," Grandfather said without turning around. "Thought I might have to come drag you out of bed myself." Sam slid into his usual chair at the kitchen table, his eyes drawn inevitably to the window facing the barn. From here, he couldn't see the cellar entrance, but he knew it was there. Knew she was there, probably listening to their voices drifting across the yard and wondering if today would bring rescue or just another 24 hours of captivity. "Got some news from town," Grandfather continued conversationally, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before Sam. "Young Jenny Morrison's gone missing. Disappeared from her folks' place sometime Monday night." Sam's fork clattered against his plate. Jenny Morrison was 16, with honey-colored hair and a laugh that could brighten the dreariest day. She worked at Patterson's general store and always slipped Sam an extra piece of penny candy when her father wasn't looking. "Missing?" Sam's voice cracked like ice on a frozen pond. "Afraid so." Grandfather settled into his own chair, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. "Her parents are beside themselves with worry. Left her bedroom window open, all her belongings still there. Looks like she just vanished into thin air." But Sam knew better now. Jenny hadn't vanished into thin air. She'd vanished into the basement of the jail, or maybe another hidden cellar somewhere on the Carter property. How many other buildings held secrets? How many other locked rooms harbored horrors? "Course, I've got the whole department out looking for her," Grandfather continued, cutting his eggs with surgical precision. "Organized search parties, contacted the state police, put out bulletins to neighboring counties. We'll find her, don't you worry." The lie rolled off his tongue smooth as butter. Sam watched the man he'd called grandfather his entire life and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. Every gesture, every expression felt calculated now. A performance crafted over decades of practice. Maybe she just ran away, Sam suggested quietly, testing the waters. Maybe she wanted to start over somewhere new. Grandfather's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Now why would you say a thing like that, son? Jenny Morrison had everything a girl could want right here in Millfield. Good family, decent prospects, a whole community that cared about her. What would make a sensible girl like that want to run away? The question carried an undertone that made Sam's blood run cold. Was grandfather fishing for information? Did he suspect Sam knew something? The weight of those grey eyes felt crushing, like being studied by a hawk circling high above a cornfield. I don't know, Sam mumbled, focusing intently on his breakfast. Just something I heard at school, I guess. Well, you shouldn't go repeating idle gossip, grandfather said, but his tone remained gentle. Folks are scared enough without wild theories making things worse. Sometimes good people just disappear. That's the sad truth of the world, Samuel. All we can do is hope for the best and prepare for the worst. After breakfast, grandfather announced he'd be spending the day coordinating search efforts for Jenny Morrison. The irony wasn't lost on Sam, the wolf organizing the hunt for his own missing sheep. As the sheriff's truck disappeared down the dusty ranch road, Sam felt the walls of his ordinary world finally crumble completely. He stood at the kitchen window, staring at the barn that had sheltered his family's darkest secrets for generations. Inside that structure waited his grandmother, a woman who'd been erased from history while her captor played the role of grieving widower. And somewhere else, God only knew where, Jenny Morrison was beginning her own nightmare. The choice Eleanor had warned him about was no longer theoretical. It stood before him stark and unavoidable: remain silent and become complicit in grandfather's crimes, or act and risk destroying the only life he'd ever known. In the distance, a meadowlark sang from a fence post, its melody sweet and oblivious to the darkness stirring below. Sam remained frozen at the kitchen window long after the meadowlark song faded into silence. His reflection stared back from the glass, pale, wide-eyed, looking far younger than his 8 years. The boy in the window seemed like a stranger now, someone from a simpler time when the worst thing he had to worry about was finishing his arithmetic homework or remembering to feed the chickens. The rational part of his mind, the part that still desperately wanted to believe in heroes and happy endings, whispered seductive lies. Maybe you imagined it all. Maybe the woman in the cellar was just a fever dream. Maybe grandfather really is searching for Jenny Morrison to bring her home safe. But the weight in his chest told a different story. It pressed down like a physical thing, making each breath an effort. This was the weight of terrible knowledge, of seeing behind the curtain that separated childhood innocence from adult horrors. Once glimpsed, it could never be unseen. Sam's hands trembled as he washed the breakfast dishes, the same chore he'd performed countless mornings without thought. Now even this simple task felt different. Washing the plate grandfather had eaten from, the fork that had touched his lips, cleaning away traces of a monster's meal. The soapy water turned cold between his fingers, but he barely noticed. What terrified him most wasn't just grandfather's crimes, but his own capacity for pretense. How easily he'd sat at that table, nodding and responding appropriately while horror churned in his stomach. Was this how evil perpetuated itself? Through silence, through the small compromises that accumulated like snowflakes until they buried the truth entirely? The clock on the mantelpiece ticked away precious minutes. Somewhere, Jenny Morrison was learning the same lessons Eleanor had learned 20 years ago. That monsters could wear badges, that screams went unanswered in the right places, that the very people trusted to protect society could be its greatest predators. Each tick brought her deeper into nightmare. But what could an 8-year-old boy possibly do against a man who'd fooled an entire town for decades? Grandfather wasn't just Sam's guardian. He was the sheriff, respected and feared in equal measure. Who would believe a child's word against such a pillar of the community? And even if someone did listen, what proof did Sam have beyond the ravings of a woman who'd been declared dead 20 years ago? The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Sam had no horse, no money, no way to reach the state police in Helena without grandfather's knowledge. The nearest neighbor was the Henderson farm, 3 miles through open pasture where he'd be visible for miles. Mrs. Henderson would simply march him home and report his strange behavior to grandfather, sealing both their fates. Worse still was the creeping realization that others must know, or at least suspect, a man couldn't make women disappear for decades without leaving traces, the way certain families avoided the Carter Ranch, the hushed conversations that stopped when Sam entered Patterson's general store, the fear he'd always attributed to grandfather's authority as sheriff. It all made horrible sense now. If the adults knew and chose silence, what hope did a child have? Sam found himself at his bedroom window again, staring down at the barn with a mixture of longing and dread. Eleanor was waiting down there in the darkness, probably listening for any sound that might indicate rescue or discovery. She'd survived 20 years of captivity by clinging to hope that someone would come, someone would care enough to risk everything for justice. That someone was now an 8-year-old boy who still slept with a stuffed bear and couldn't reach the top shelf in the pantry. The weight of inadequacy crushed down on him. Eleanor deserved a hero, someone strong and brave and clever enough to outwit a lifetime predator. Instead, she'd gotten a frightened child who couldn't even work up the courage to steal food from his own kitchen. What if he tried to help and only made things worse? What if his fumbling attempts at rescue got them both killed? The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the ranch into a furnace of heat and regret. Sam watched dust devils dance across the pastures where he'd played cowboys and Indians just days ago, back when he'd believed good always triumphed over evil, because that's how stories were supposed to end. But this wasn't a story. This was real life, where monsters wore familiar faces and heroes were in desperately short supply. As evening shadows began to stretch across the yard, Sam heard the distant rumble of grandfather's truck returning from town. Soon there would be another performance to endure, another meal shared with a killer, another night sleeping under the same roof as unspeakable evil. The choice Eleanor had spoken of still waited, growing heavier with each passing hour. But tonight, Sam realized with shameful relief, he wasn't ready to make it. Tomorrow, perhaps. Tomorrow he might find the courage that eluded him today. The meadowlark sang again from its fence post, and this time its song sounded like a funeral dirge. Tomorrow came with the sound of screaming. Sam jolted awake in the pre-dawn darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sound drifted across the ranch yard, thin, desperate, barely audible above the wind that rattled his bedroom window. For a terrifying moment he thought it might be Eleanor, that grandfather had discovered their encounter and was extracting punishment in ways Sam's mind refused to imagine. But as he pressed his face to the cold glass, peering toward the barn through the grey half-light, he realized the sound was coming from somewhere else entirely. From the direction of the old equipment shed, maybe, or the disused grain silo that had stood empty since before Sam was born. How many hidden chambers existed on the Carter property? How many other women had been swallowed by this seemingly innocent ranch? The screaming stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the whisper of wind through autumn grass. Sam remained at the window, shivering in his nightclothes, watching shadows shift across familiar landscape that now felt alien and threatening. Every building, every fence post, every ordinary feature of his childhood home might be concealing horrors he'd never imagined. Jenny Morrison was out there somewhere, learning what Eleanor had learned 20 years ago. When breakfast time arrived, grandfather appeared at the kitchen table looking perfectly rested, humming his customary tune while reading the Millfield Gazette. He glanced up as Sam descended the stairs, his grey eyes crinkling with familiar warmth. "Morning, sleepyhead? Sleep well?" The casual question hit Sam like a physical blow. Sleep well? While somewhere on their property, a 16-year-old girl was probably chained in darkness, terrified and calling for help that would never come. Sam felt bile rise in his throat, but forced himself to nod. "Yes, sir," Like a log. Good, good. Growing boys need their rest. Grandfather folded the newspaper with practiced precision. Afraid there's still no word on young Jenny Morrison. Poor girl seems to have vanished without a trace. Sam stared at the man who'd raised him, searching for any crack in that benevolent facade. But grandfather's expression remained perfectly composed, concerned, paternal, tinged with appropriate sadness for a missing child. If Sam hadn't seen Eleanor chained in the cellar with his own eyes, he never would have suspected the truth. The performance was flawless, honed by decades of practice. "I'll be working late again tonight," grandfather continued, rising from his chair. "Got to coordinate with the state police, follow up on some leads. You'll be all right on your own for supper?" Another lie, delivered with such casual sincerity that Sam almost believed it himself. There were no leads to follow, no coordination with state police. Grandfather would probably spend the evening visiting his prisoners, bringing them just enough food and water to keep them alive while he savored their terror. "I'll be fine," Sam managed, though the words felt like gravel in his throat. After grandfather left for town, Sam found himself standing in the kitchen doorway, staring at the familiar space where they'd shared thousands of meals together. The coffee cup grandfather had drunk from still sat in the sink, lipstick stained with the remnants of his morning routine. Such an ordinary thing, yet now it seemed obscene, evidence of normalcy layered over unspeakable evil. The rational voice in Sam's head made one last desperate attempt at denial. "You're 8 years old. This is too big for you. Let the adults handle it." But the adults were handling it, by looking the other way, by choosing willful blindness, by allowing a monster to wear a badge and call himself protector. The adults had failed Eleanor for 20 years, and now they were failing Jenny Morrison too. Sam walked slowly to his bedroom and knelt beside his narrow bed, reaching underneath to retrieve a battered wooden box where he kept his most treasured possessions. His father's military compass, a collection of arrowheads found in the creek bed, $3 silver saved from birthday gifts, and his mother's wedding ring, the only thing of hers grandfather had allowed him to keep. As his fingers closed around the smooth gold band, Sam felt something shift inside his chest. The crushing weight that had paralyzed him for 2 days began to transform into something else, something harder and more focused. His parents were gone, stolen by the same man who'd stolen Eleanor's life and was now stealing Jenny's. The boy Sam had been was gone too, murdered by terrible knowledge in a root cellar beneath an old barn. What remained was someone new, someone who understood that heroes weren't born brave. They became brave when all other choices were stripped away. Sam stood slowly, slipping his mother's ring into his pocket like a talisman. When he looked toward the barn now, he no longer saw an insurmountable obstacle. He saw his grandmother, waiting in darkness for someone to care enough to risk everything. Tonight, when grandfather left to visit his prisoners, that someone would finally act. The funeral dirge of yesterday's meadowlark had become a war cry. The first test came sooner than Sam expected. He was gathering eggs from the hen house when he heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. A dust-covered pickup truck pulled to a stop near the porch, and Sam's heart nearly seized when he recognized the driver stepping out. Deputy Marcus Webb, grandfather's second in command and closest friend on the force. Webb was a thick-set man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made him popular with the town's children. He'd taught Sam to whittle last summer, showing him how to coax wooden animals from discarded fence posts. Now, seeing those same hands resting on his gun belt, Sam wondered what other secrets they might conceal. "Afternoon, Sam," Webb called, tipping his hat. "Your granddad around?" "He's in town, sir, working on the Morrison case." The lie came easier than Sam expected, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Webb nodded slowly, his gaze drifting past Sam toward the barn. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to interpret, but it made Sam's skin crawl. "That's a terrible business. Poor families beside themselves with worry." "Yes, sir." Sam clutched the egg basket tighter, using it to steady his trembling hands. Was Webb here on official business, or something else entirely? Did he know about the cellar? About Eleanor? "You've been keeping close to the house, I hope," Webb continued, still watching the barn. Dangerous times for young folks to be wandering off alone. Never know what kind of trouble might find them. The words carried an undertone that made Sam's blood freeze. Was that a warning or a threat? Webb's expression remained neutral, but something predatory lurked beneath the surface, a shark moving through familiar waters. "I stay close," Sam managed. "Good boy. Smart boy." Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your granddad's raised you right. Family loyalty's important, Sam, more important than anything else. You remember that." As the deputy drove away, Sam realized with sickening clarity that he wasn't alone in this nightmare. Webb knew. Maybe others in the sheriff's department knew too. How many men wearing badges were complicit in grandfather's crimes? How deep did the corruption run? The second test came that evening as Sam prepared for his midnight mission. He'd hidden supplies throughout the day, rope from the barn, a lantern, kitchen scraps wrapped in cheesecloth, when he discovered something that nearly shattered his resolve entirely. In grandfather's desk drawer, searching for keys that might unlock Eleanor's chains, Sam found a leather journal bound with twine. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in grandfather's careful handwriting. Dates, names, locations, a meticulous record spanning decades. March 15th, 1931. Sarah Whitmore, age 19. Resistant at first but adapting well to confinement. Moved to cellar beneath Old Mill, June 2nd, 1934. Mary Chen, age 22. Too defiant. Disposal necessary. Creek bed, north pasture. September 18th, 1941. Eleanor Carter, age 24. Special circumstances require long-term arrangement. Primary location established. Page after page of clinical observations about women who'd vanished, women who'd been tortured, women who'd died. Sam's hands shook as he read, his young mind struggling to process the systematic nature of grandfather's evil. This wasn't the work of a man driven by sudden passion. It was the methodical cruelty of someone who viewed other human beings as toys to be collected and discarded. The final entry was dated just 2 days ago. Jenny Morrison, age 16. Initial placement successful. High spirit may require additional conditioning. Sam slammed the journal shut, bile burning his throat. Additional conditioning. He thought of Jenny's bright laugh, her kindness at the general store, and wanted to scream until his lungs burst. She was alive, somewhere on the property, but for how long? But then, buried beneath his horror, Sam discovered something unexpected, an ally he'd never considered. The journal revealed another name that made him gasp. Thomas Webb, reliable asset, continues to provide valuable assistance with acquisitions and disposal. Deputy Webb wasn't just complicit, he was an active participant. But that terrible knowledge came with an opportunity Sam hadn't foreseen. If Webb was working with grandfather, he might know the locations of other holding sites. He might even have keys or schedules that could help Sam navigate the web of horrors surrounding him. The idea of approaching a killer for help seemed insane, but as Sam stared at the journal's damning pages, a desperate plan began forming in his mind. Webb thought Sam was just an innocent child, someone who could be intimidated into silence with vague threats about family loyalty. What if Sam played that role perfectly? What if he could convince Webb he was willing to join their conspiracy? The risk was enormous. One wrong word, one suspicious gesture, and Sam would join the names in grandfather's journal. But Jenny Morrison was running out of time, and Eleanor had waited 20 years for someone brave enough to act. As midnight approached, Sam realized his war cry had attracted both enemies and potential allies. In this twisted game, where monsters wore badges and children carried the weight of justice, he would need every advantage he could find. The hunt for truth was about to begin. The hunt began with the creak of floorboards beneath Sam's bare feet. He moved through the darkened house like a ghost, each step calculated to avoid the loose board by the bathroom door, the squeaky spot near the kitchen threshold that had betrayed countless midnight raids on the cookie jar. Those innocent transgressions seemed like ancient history now, relics from a time when his greatest fear was grandfather's gentle scolding rather than his grandfather's true nature. The journal felt like a lead weight in Sam's shirt pocket, its pages crackling softly with each heartbeat. He'd memorized the most crucial details before hiding it back in the desk drawer, locations, dates, Webb's role in the conspiracy. The knowledge burned inside him like swallowed poison, but it also provided something he desperately needed: leverage. Outside, Montana's night sky stretched endlessly overhead, brilliant with stars that had witnessed 20 years of Eleanor's captivity. Sam paused on the porch steps, breathing in air that carried the scent of hay and distant rain. Tomorrow night, if his plan worked, that same air might taste of freedom. If it failed, he might never taste anything again. The walk to Webb's house took 40 minutes through fields where knee-high grass whispered secrets to the wind. Sam had traveled this route countless times during daylight hours, racing his bicycle along the dirt road that connected the scattered ranches. But darkness transformed familiar landmarks into alien shapes. Fence posts became crouching figures, windmills turned into towering specters, and every shadow might conceal watching eyes. Webb lived in a modest cabin on the outskirts of Millfield, close enough to town for quick response to emergencies, but isolated enough for privacy. As Sam crouched behind a stand of cottonwoods 50 yards from the house, he realized that isolation served another purpose entirely. No neighbors to hear unexpected sounds, no witnesses to late-night visitors who might arrive bound and unconscious. A single light burned in Webb's kitchen window. Through the thin curtains, Sam could see the deputy's silhouette moving back and forth, pacing, perhaps, or preparing for another nocturnal visit to grandfather's hidden chambers. The sight made Sam's stomach clench, but he forced himself to remain focused. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with lives hanging in the balance. The approach required every ounce of courage Sam possessed. He emerged from the trees with deliberate noise, scuffing his feet on gravel and sniffling as though he'd been crying. When he knocked on Webb's door, he let his voice crack with carefully manufactured terror. "Mr. Webb, please, I need help." The door opened cautiously, revealing Webb's bulk silhouetted against the kitchen light. His hand rested near his sidearm, but his expression shifted to concern when he recognized his visitor. "Sam? Good Lord, boy, what are you doing out here at this hour?" Webb's voice carried genuine surprise, though Sam detected an undertone of wariness. "Does your grandfather know where you are?" "That's just it," Sam whispered, allowing tears to gather in his eyes. "I can't tell grandfather. He'd be so angry, and I don't know what to do." Webb's demeanor changed subtly, predatory instincts awakening behind kindly eyes. He stepped aside, gesturing Sam into the cabin's warm interior. "Come in, son. Tell me what's troubling you." The kitchen smelled of coffee and cigarettes, with an underlying mustiness that made Sam think of confined spaces and unwashed bodies. A map of the county spread across the table, marked with red X's in locations Sam didn't recognize. Webb casually folded it as they sat, but not before Sam glimpsed several annotations in his grandfather's handwriting. "I found something," Sam began, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the barn cellar. A woman who says she knows grandfather, who claims—" He let his words trail off, watching Webb's reaction carefully. The deputy's face remained neutral, but his hands stilled completely, a predator's absolute focus when prey wandered within striking distance. "That's quite a claim, Sam. What exactly did this woman tell you?" "Crazy things, impossible things about grandfather hurting people, about other women being held prisoner." Sam wiped his nose with his sleeve, projecting the image of a confused, frightened child. "I know it can't be true. Grandfather's the sheriff. He protects people. But she seemed so certain, and she knew things about our family. Webb leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You did the right thing coming to me, Sam. This is very serious business. Too serious for a boy your age to handle alone. You believe me? About the woman? I believe you found someone who's filled your head with dangerous lies. Webb's smile held sharp edges now. But don't worry. Your grandfather and I know how to handle situations like this. We've been protecting our community from troubled individuals for many years. Sam felt ice crystallize in his veins. Webb wasn't just admitting complicity, he was welcoming Sam into their conspiracy, assuming the boy could be molded into another silent accomplice. The casual arrogance was breathtaking, and it revealed exactly how they'd operated for decades. Find the vulnerable, offer them protection and purpose, then bind them with shared guilt until escape became impossible. What should I do? Sam asked, his voice small and lost. Webb's hand settled on his shoulder with paternal warmth. First, you're going to show me exactly where you found this woman. Then we're going to have a long talk about family loyalty and what it means to protect the people we love. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Sam realized his desperate gamble was succeeding beyond his wildest hopes. Webb trusted him completely, saw him as nothing more than another frightened child to be manipulated and controlled. The monster had no idea he was being hunted by prey that had learned to bite back. The barn loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a monument to buried sins as Sam led Webb across the moonlit pasture. Each step felt like a betrayal of everything he'd believed about courage, walking willingly into the spider's web, guiding a killer to his grandmother's prison. But Eleanor's words echoed in his memory. Sometimes the only way out is through the heart of darkness itself. Webb moved beside him with predatory grace, one hand resting casually on his sidearm while the other gripped a heavy flashlight that could serve as weapon or illumination. "You're being very brave, Sam," he murmured, his voice carrying false warmth. "Most boys your age would be too frightened to face the truth about dangerous people." Sam forced himself to nod, though his throat felt lined with sandpaper. The deputy's words confirmed what he'd suspected. This wasn't Webb's first time recruiting a child into their conspiracy of silence. How many other boys had walked this same path, been offered the same poisonous comfort until they became men who looked the other way when women vanished? Lightning flickered overhead as they reached the barn's weathered entrance. Sam's hands trembled as he lifted the wooden bar, but Webb interpreted the shaking as fear rather than rage. The massive doors groaned open, revealing the familiar scent of hay and leather that now carried undertones of something far more sinister. "She's down there," Sam whispered, pointing toward the cellar entrance hidden beneath scattered feed sacks. "I heard crying and went to investigate. I thought maybe an animal was trapped." Webb's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like restless spirits. "You have good instincts, son. But sometimes, when we try to help, we discover things that are too complicated for simple solutions." As they descended the narrow stairs, Sam felt the weight of 20 years pressing down around them. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with despair and the metallic taste of fear. Behind them, the storm arrived in earnest, rain drumming against the barn's roof like fingertips tapping an urgent message. Eleanor sat exactly where Sam had left her, chained to the wooden post with her back straight and eyes alert despite her exhaustion. She looked up as Webb's flashlight found her face, and Sam watched 20 years of careful hope crumble into dust. "Hello, Eleanor," Webb said conversationally, as though greeting a neighbor at the general store. "I see you've been entertaining young Sam with stories." "Marcus," her voice carried no surprise, only infinite weariness. "Still playing the faithful dog, I see. Tell me, does it ever get tiresome cleaning up Henry's messes?" Webb's genial mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and vicious underneath. "I prefer to think of it as community service. Some people are too dangerous to walk free, Eleanor. You proved that when you tried to poison a good man's reputation with your hysterical accusations." Sam stood frozen between them. watching 20 years of hatred and betrayal play out in whispered exchanges. Webb spoke about Eleanor as though she were genuinely deranged, and Sam realized the deputy had convinced himself that their crimes were acts of protection. They weren't monsters in their own minds, they were guardians, keeping dangerous women away from decent society. "Sam doesn't know the whole truth yet," Webb continued, turning to study the boy with calculating eyes. "But he's old enough to understand that some secrets are worth keeping. Aren't you, son?" This was the moment Sam had dreaded, the test that would determine whether he lived or joined Eleanor in chains. Everything hinged on his ability to convince a killer that an 8-year-old boy could be trusted with mass murder. "She told me terrible things about grandfather," Sam whispered, his voice cracking with manufactured confusion. "But they can't be true. He raised me. He loves me." "Of course he loves you." Webb's smile returned, warm and paternal. "And part of love is protecting the people we care about from ugly truths. Your grandfather has made hard choices to keep our community safe, choices that weak people might misunderstand." Sam felt bile rise in his throat as Webb knelt beside him, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. The deputy's fingers were gentle, almost fatherly, as he explained why kidnapping and torture were actually acts of mercy. Sam realized this was how they'd operated for decades, not through fear alone, but through twisted logic that transformed evil into virtue. "What happens now?" Sam asked, though he dreaded the answer. Webb's grip tightened slightly. "Now you learn what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. Your grandfather has been training you for this moment your whole life, Sam. Tonight, you become a real man." Thunder crashed overhead as Sam understood the full horror of his situation. Webb wasn't just threatening to kill him, he was offering something infinitely worse. A chance to join their brotherhood of monsters, to let his soul rot away one compromise at a time until he became another smiling predator in a sheriff's uniform. The ordeal had begun, and Sam realized that surviving it might require him to become something he'd never imagined, a child willing to kill to save the innocent. The storm's fury seemed gentle compared to the violence that erupted in the cellar's confines. Sam's carefully constructed plan shattered the moment Webb's radio crackled to life, grandfather's voice cutting through the static like a blade through silk. "Marcus, you there? Boy's not in his bed. Could be we have ourselves a problem." Webb's hand froze on Sam's shoulder, his paternal mask dissolving into something predatory and alert. The deputy's eyes narrowed as he studied Sam's face, seeing past the manufactured confusion to the calculation beneath. "Well now," he murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper that raised goosebumps along Sam's arms. "Seems we might have ourselves a little actor." Eleanor's chains rattled as she shifted forward, desperation bleeding through her exhaustion. "Run, Sam. Please just run." But there was nowhere to go. Webb's bulk blocked the narrow stairs, and the cellar's stone walls pressed in from all sides like a tomb. Sam felt his carefully rehearsed lies crumble as the deputy reached for his radio, thumb hovering over the transmission button. "Henry? Found your boy. Situation's more complicated than we thought." The words hit Sam like physical blows. All his planning, his desperate courage, his belief that he could somehow outwit grown men who'd been killing for decades, all of it revealed as childish fantasy. He wasn't a clever spy infiltrating enemy territory. He was an 8-year-old boy who'd walked willingly into a predator's den. "Smart kid," Webb continued into the radio, his free hand now resting openly on his sidearm. "Too smart for his own good, I'm thinking. Yeah, he found her. Knows about the others, too, from what he's letting slip." Grandfather's response crackled through static, but Sam caught enough words to understand his fate was being decided in casual conversation between monsters. Liability. Containment. Permanent solution. "Please," Sam whispered, abandoning all pretense now. "I won't tell anyone. I promise. I'll never say anything about—" Webb's backhanded slap sent Sam sprawling across the dirt floor, stars exploding behind his eyes. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he struggled to his knees, childhood innocence finally dying in the cellar's suffocating darkness. "Begging's beneath you, boy," Webb said almost gently. Your grandfather raised you better than that." Through the ringing in his ears, Sam heard Eleanor sobbing. 20 years of carefully maintained hope finally breaking as she watched another innocent soul about to join her in eternal captivity. The sound was worse than his physical pain, worse than his terror, because it confirmed what he'd refused to believe, that evil sometimes won, that monsters sometimes kept their prey, that children sometimes disappeared forever into darkness beneath familiar barns. "The truck's already loaded," Grandfather's voice emerged from the radio with casual efficiency. "Been planning to relocate the operation anyway. Too much attention lately with that Morrison girl's disappearance. Time for a fresh start." Webb nodded as though Grandfather could see him. "What about the boy? Can't exactly explain him vanishing to the whole county." Static filled the silence before Grandfather's response chilled Sam's blood. "Tragic accident. Boy got curious about the old mine shaft up on Crow's Peak. These things happen. Community will rally around a grieving old man who's lost his only family." Sam's vision blurred with tears he could no longer control. They weren't just going to kill him. They were going to erase him, turn his murder into a story that would generate sympathy for the monster who'd raised him. The entire town would attend his funeral, never knowing they were mourning a victim of the very man they'd comfort in his grief. Eleanor's chains rattled as she strained against her bonds, maternal fury overwhelming 20 years of learned helplessness. "You bastards. You goddamn bastards. He's just a child." "Child who knew too much," Webb replied matter-of-factly, already moving toward the stairs. "Your fault, really. Should have kept your mouth shut when he found you. Now you get to watch another innocent soul join our little family before we pack up and start fresh somewhere new." As Webb's footsteps echoed up the stairs, Sam realized with crystal clarity that his war cry had accomplished nothing except alerting the enemy to his presence. Jenny Morrison was still captive somewhere on the property. Eleanor would remain chained until death claimed her, and by tomorrow night Sam Carter would be just another name in Grandfather's meticulous journal. The dark moment had arrived, and with it, the terrible understanding that sometimes good intentions weren't enough. Sometimes children who tried to fight monsters simply became smaller monsters themselves or disappeared entirely into the darkness they'd sought to illuminate. Thunder crashed overhead as Sam curled into a ball on the cellar floor, waiting for his grandfather's gentle footsteps to descend the stairs one final time. The minutes stretched like hours as Sam lay curled on the cellar's dirt floor, his body trembling from more than just the cold seeping through stone walls. Above them, the storm raged with biblical fury, but the real tempest lived in the silence between thunder crashes, the pregnant quiet that meant Grandfather was coming. Eleanor's voice cut through his despair, barely a whisper but sharp as broken glass. "Sam, listen to me." He lifted his head, tasting blood where Webb's backhand had split his lip. Eleanor's eyes blazed with an intensity that seemed to illuminate the darkness around her weathered face. 20 years I've been down here," she continued, her words rapid and urgent. 20 years of watching that monster pretend to be your loving grandfather while he perfected his collection. But you know what I learned in all that time?" Sam shook his head, unable to speak past the terror lodged in his throat. "Henry Carter isn't invincible. He's just a man who's gotten very, very good at making people believe his lies." Eleanor's chains rattled as she leaned forward as far as her bonds would allow, including the lie he tells himself every single day. "What lie?" "That he's protecting people. That women like me are dangerous, unstable, threats to decent society that need to be contained." Eleanor's laugh held 20 years of bitter understanding. "He's convinced himself he's a hero, Sam, and that delusion is his weakness." The words seemed impossible. How could believing yourself righteous be a weakness when it let you sleep peacefully after committing atrocities? But as Sam stared into his grandmother's eyes, his grandmother, a woman whose very existence rewrote everything he thought he knew about family, a terrible clarity began to dawn. "He loves me," Sam whispered, the words torn from some deep, wounded place. "I know he does. I can see it in his eyes when he reads me bedtime stories, when he teaches me to ride, when he— Of course he loves you. Eleanor's voice carried infinite gentleness now. That's what makes this so much worse. Henry Carter is capable of genuine love, Sam. He loved me once too, before I became inconvenient, before I threatened his carefully constructed world by asking too many questions about missing women. Thunder crashed overhead, so close the barn's timbers groaned in response. In the brief silence that followed, Sam heard what he'd been dreading: footsteps crossing the barn floor above. Measured, unhurried, familiar. Grandfather walking with the same steady gait he used when checking on sick cattle or investigating reports of rustling. He compartmentalizes, Eleanor continued urgently. The man who raised you and the man who keeps women chained in darkness, they're separate in his mind, completely separate. He can love you with genuine warmth while planning your murder because in his twisted logic, killing you is love, protecting you from becoming someone who might expose his work. The revelation hit Sam like ice water flooding his veins. Grandfather wasn't a monster who occasionally felt human emotion. He was a human being who'd learned to make monstrous choices feel like moral imperatives. The bedtime stories were real. The gentle hands teaching him to whittle were real. The pride in Grandfather's eyes when Sam successfully roped a calf was genuine. And that made everything infinitely worse. "He'll cry at your funeral," Eleanor whispered as the footsteps reached the barn's entrance. "Real tears, Sam. He'll genuinely mourn the grandson he loves while telling himself your death was necessary to preserve something greater." The barn doors groaned open. Sam could hear his grandfather moving efficiently through the familiar space, probably gathering supplies for another relocation, another fresh start in another unsuspecting community, where Sheriff Henry Carter would build another sterling reputation while perfecting his collection of inconvenient women. But Eleanor wasn't finished. The children, Sam. All these years I wondered how he managed to operate so openly, how he avoided suspicion, investigation, discovery. But watching him with you, I finally understood. What do you mean? He uses the children, not just you, every child he's ever helped, every family he's assisted, every scout troop he's sponsored. You're his camouflage, his proof of goodness, his shield against suspicion. Eleanor's voice dropped to barely audible. A man who's so wonderful with children couldn't possibly hurt anyone, could he? The footsteps on the stairs began, deliberate, unhurried, accompanied by a tuneless humming that Sam recognized. The same melody Grandfather hummed while making breakfast, while oiling his saddle, while performing any routine task with quiet contentment. He was humming while coming to murder his grandson. Sam understood with crystalline clarity that this revelation changed everything. Grandfather wasn't an incomprehensible monster. He was a human being who'd learned to rationalize evil as good, and if his delusions could be shattered, if his carefully constructed justifications could crumble, the real war wasn't for Sam's life. It was for his grandfather's soul. The humming stopped halfway down the stairs. Sam forced himself to sit up straighter, wiping blood from his split lip with the back of his hand. In the suffocating darkness, he could feel Eleanor watching him, 20 years of despair suddenly crackling with something that might have been hope. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. When Grandfather's footsteps resumed, they carried a different rhythm, hesitant now, almost reluctant. The beam of his flashlight preceded him into the cellar, sweeping across the stone walls before settling on Sam's upturned face. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, Grandfather and grandson simply stared at each other across an abyss that had opened between them. "Hello, Sam." Grandfather's voice carried the same gentle warmth it always had, tinged now with infinite sadness. "Webb tells me you've been asking difficult questions." "Hello, Grandfather." Sam's voice emerged, steadier than he'd dared hope. "I've been getting difficult answers." Henry Carter descended the final steps with the measured pace of a man approaching his own execution. In the flashlight's glow, Sam could see exhaustion etched deep into familiar features, the same face that had smiled while teaching him to fish, that had shown such pride when Sam successfully rode his first bronco. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. "I suppose Eleanor's been filling your head with stories," Grandfather continued, his tone carrying the same patient disappointment he used when Sam tracked mud through the house. "She always was good with stories. Too good, perhaps." Eleanor's chains rattled softly as she shifted against her wooden post. "Tell him the truth, Henry. For once in 20 years, just tell someone the truth." Grandfather's flashlight beam swung toward her, and Sam saw something flicker across his weathered features, not anger, but something closer to grief. "The truth? The truth is that some people are too dangerous to walk free, Eleanor. You proved that when you threatened to destroy everything good I'd built in this community. By asking questions about missing women? By spreading poison." Grandfather's voice hardened slightly, revealing steel beneath the gentle exterior. "By trying to turn decent people against their protector. By forcing me to choose between the greater good and what, Henry?" Eleanor leaned forward as far as her bonds allowed, eyes blazing. "Say it! You were forced to choose between your reputation and your wife's life." The words hung in the cellar's stifling air like an accusation from beyond the grave. Sam watched his grandfather's face crumble and rebuild itself in the span of seconds, 20 years of carefully constructed justifications, warring with some deeper, more human truth. "She was going to ruin everything," Grandfather whispered. And for the first time his voice carried doubt instead of certainty. "Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, the safety I'd provided to this community for decades." Sam felt pieces clicking together in his mind with awful clarity. "That's not why you kept her, though." Both adults turned toward him, Eleanor with surprise, Grandfather with something approaching fear. "You kept her because you loved her," Sam continued, his child's intuition cutting straight to the heart of 20 years of self-deception. "Because even when you told yourself she was dangerous, even when you convinced yourself this was necessary, you couldn't actually kill your own wife." The flashlight trembled in Grandfather's hands, its beam dancing wildly across stone walls. "You don't understand, Sam. You're too young to understand the complexities." "I understand that you're not a monster." Sam struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as blood rushed to his head. "Monsters don't spend 20 years keeping their victims alive. Monsters don't cry themselves to sleep like you do sometimes when you think I'm not listening." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by water dripping somewhere in the cellar's depths and the storm's fury overhead. Sam could hear his grandfather's breathing becoming ragged, 20 years of careful compartmentalization beginning to crack under the weight of a child's unforgiving honesty. "The other women," Sam pressed, sensing weakness for the first time. "Where are they?" Grandfather's face went ashen. "Sam, you don't want to—" "Jenny Morrison, where is she?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Sam could see his grandfather struggling, the man who'd raised him warring with the monster who'd imprisoned his own wife. For 20 years, Henry Carter had managed to keep these two sides of himself separate, distinct, never allowing them to meet in the harsh light of examination. But now his grandson, his beloved grandson who carried his blood and his name, was forcing them together with the brutal clarity that only children possessed. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a prayer. "It's not too late, Henry. It's never too late to choose differently." And in that moment, Sam felt something shift in the cellar's oppressive atmosphere. Not victory, not yet, but possibility. The faintest glimmer of hope that even monsters might remember how to be human when faced with someone who still believed in their capacity for redemption. Henry Carter's flashlight beam wavered as his grandson's words echoed in the suffocating darkness. 20 years of carefully constructed justifications trembled on the edge of collapse, and Sam could see the exact moment when his grandfather's two worlds, protector and predator, finally, inevitably collided. "Jenny Morrison," Grandfather whispered, the name escaping like a confession torn from his soul. She's in the old mine shaft, Crow's Peak." His voice cracked with each word. Alive. They're all alive, Sam. I couldn't. The admission hit the cellar like a physical force. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath cut through the oppressive air. 20 years of wondering about the fate of other women suddenly answered. Sam felt his legs nearly give out, not from relief, but from the staggering weight of what this meant. How many? Sam's voice was barely audible. Grandfather's shoulders sagged as decades of secret burden finally found voice. 7, including Eleanor. 7 women who asked too many questions, who threatened to expose. He couldn't finish the sentence. Who threatened to expose your collection of trophies, Eleanor said with bitter understanding. 7 women who discovered what their beloved sheriff really was. But Sam was already moving past the horror towards something more urgent. Jenny Morrison was alive. The other women were alive. Which meant this wasn't just about confronting a monster, it was about saving lives that could still be saved. Webb doesn't know, does he? Sam pressed, his 8-year-old mind grasping tactical implications with startling clarity. About them being alive. He thinks you kill them. Grandfather nodded miserably. Webb is useful for certain tasks, but he lacks the subtlety for the real work. He believes I dispose of problems permanently. It's easier that way. The revelation crystallized everything for Sam. His grandfather wasn't just a killer who'd learned to rationalize murder. He was a broken man who couldn't bring himself to actually commit the ultimate evil, creating instead an elaborate prison system that let him maintain his delusions while keeping his victims breathing. You have to choose, Sam said, and his voice carried an authority that seemed impossible from someone so young. Right now, tonight, you have to choose who you really are. Grandfather's face crumpled. It's not that simple. Sam Webb is already suspicious. If you and Eleanor aren't dealt with, he'll start asking questions I can't answer. And if he discovers the others are alive, then we make sure he doesn't. Sam stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he stood within arm's reach of the man who'd raised him. We finish this together. Eleanor's chains rattled as she strained against her bonds. Sam, no, you can't trust him. 20 years of imprisonment, 20 years of him keeping you alive when he could have killed you, Sam interrupted, never taking his eyes off his grandfather's face. 20 years of him feeding you, caring for you, even when his own deputy expected you to be dead and buried. The truth hung between them like a lifeline thrown across churning waters. Henry Carter had convinced himself he was protecting the community by imprisoning dangerous women, but the deeper truth was that he'd never possessed the stomach for actual murder. His elaborate justifications were just a way to avoid confronting his own inability to kill the women he genuinely believed threatened his carefully constructed world. Help me, Sam said simply. Help me save them all, including yourself. Grandfather's hand trembled as he reached toward Sam's face, stopping just short of the bruise Webb's backhand had left. I wanted to protect you from this, from knowing what your family really was. My family is a man who couldn't murder his own wife even when he convinced himself she deserved to die, Sam replied. My family is a grandfather who spent 20 years taking care of women he imprisoned because some part of him knew it was wrong. Above them, thunder crashed with renewed fury, and through the storm's chaos, Sam heard something that made his blood freeze, Webb's voice calling from the barn entrance, rough with suspicion and growing impatience. Henry, what's taking so long down there? We need to move before this storm clears. Grandfather and grandson locked eyes in the flashlight's wavering beam. Sam could see his grandfather's internal war reaching its climax, 20 years of careful compartmentalization finally crumbling under the weight of choice made manifest. It's not too late, Sam whispered, echoing Eleanor's earlier words. It's never too late to choose differently. Henry Carter closed his eyes for a heartbeat that lasted forever. When he opened them again, Sam saw something he'd never witnessed before. His grandfather making a choice not based on elaborate justification or careful rationalization, but on the simple, terrifying recognition of right and wrong. Webb doesn't leave this property alive, grandfather said quietly, and come morning, 7 women go free. The final confrontation was no longer looming. It had arrived, and for the first time since discovering Eleanor in her chains, Sam believed they might actually survive it. Webb's boots struck the wooden steps with increasing impatience, each footfall echoing through the cellar like a countdown to catastrophe. Sam watched his grandfather's face transform in the flickering flashlight beam, 20 years of careful deception crystallizing into cold, hard purpose. "Sam," grandfather whispered urgently, "when I give the signal, you get behind Eleanor's post and stay down. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you don't move until I tell you." "Henry, what are you—" Eleanor began. "Trust me." Grandfather's voice carried an authority Sam had never heard before, not the gentle guidance of bedtime stories, but the steel of a man who'd worn a badge for 4 decades. "For the first time in 20 years, Eleanor, trust me to do the right thing." The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Webb's bulky silhouette appeared in the entrance, his own flashlight cutting through the darkness like an accusatory finger. "About damn time," Webb growled, his beams sweeping across the cellar before settling on Sam. "Took you long enough to handle one scrawny kid. Hope you didn't get too sentimental, Henry. We've got a schedule to keep." Grandfather stepped sideways, positioning himself between Webb and the wooden posts where Eleanor sat chained. The movement seemed casual, conversational, but Sam caught the deliberate placement. His grandfather was creating angles, controlling sight lines with the practiced efficiency of a lawman. "Actually, Webb, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," grandfather said, his tone carrying that same patient reasonableness he used when discussing ranch business. "About cleaning house, starting fresh." "Good." Webb's satisfaction was audible. "Knew you'd see sense eventually. Can't let sentiment compromise the operation." "You're absolutely right." Grandfather's hand drifted toward his hip where his service revolver rested in its worn leather holster. "Sentiment is dangerous. It makes a man careless, leaves loose ends that can unravel everything." Sam felt his breath catch as understanding dawned. His grandfather wasn't just positioning himself strategically. He was operating exactly like the sheriff he'd always been, methodical and precise, preparing to end a 20-year crime spree with the same careful attention to detail he'd once brought to legitimate police work. Webb stepped further into the cellar, his flashlight beam dancing across stone walls. "So we're agreed then? The kid goes tonight, and we relocate the operation by week's end?" "Oh, we're definitely ending the operation tonight," grandfather replied, and something in his tone made Webb's head snap up. "Question is, Webb, in all these years of partnership, did you ever wonder why we never had to dig graves?" The silence that followed was pregnant with dawning suspicion. Sam could see Webb's posture shifting, his free hand moving instinctively toward his own weapon, survival instincts finally overriding his assumption of control. "What the hell are you talking about, Henry?" "7 women, Webb. 7 women who supposedly died over the past 20 years. You helped me transport them, helped me maintain the cover stories, but you never once asked why you never had to help me dispose of bodies." Webb's flashlight beam swung wildly as realization struck. "You son of a bitch, they're alive, aren't they?" "Every one of them." Grandfather's voice carried an odd note of pride, as if his inability to commit actual murder was something worth celebrating. "Fed, sheltered, cared for. Imprisoned, yes, but alive." "You goddamn fool." Webb's hand closed around his gun grip. 20 years of perfect operation, and you compromised it all because you couldn't stomach finishing the job? "No," grandfather said quietly, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced smoothness. "I compromised it all because I finally remembered what finishing the job actually means." The cellar erupted in chaos. Webb's draw was fast for a man his size, but Henry Carter had been wearing a badge since before Webb was born. The 2 shots came so close together they almost sounded like one, muzzle flashes strobing in the confined space like lightning trapped underground. Sam threw himself behind Eleanor's post as his grandfather had commanded, pressing his face against cold stone as the thunder of gunfire rolled through the cellar. He heard Webb's grunt of pain, the heavy crash of a large body hitting the floor, then a moment of profound silence broken only by the storm raging overhead. "Sam," grandfather's voice steady but strained. "It's over. You can look now." Sam peered around the wooden post. Webb lay motionless near the cellar entrance, his flashlight casting crazy shadows from where it had fallen. Grandfather stood over him, smoking revolver still in hand, but Sam could see dark stains spreading across his grandfather's shirt. "You're hurt," Sam said, moving toward him. "I'll live." Grandfather holstered his weapon and immediately moved toward Eleanor, keys already in hand. "Question is, can we get 7 women to safety before I bleed out enough to matter?" As Eleanor's chains fell away for the first time in 20 years, Sam realized the final test wasn't over. It was just beginning. They had 7 lives to save, a storm to navigate, and the most complex rescue operation an 8-year-old boy had ever attempted. But for the first time since this nightmare began, they were fighting on the same side. Eleanor's first steps in 20 years were unsteady, her legs trembling as circulation returned to limbs that had known only chains. She gripped the wooden post for support, then straightened with visible effort, meeting Sam's eyes with a mixture of gratitude and fierce determination. "The mine shaft is 3 miles north," she said, her voice stronger now that freedom was more than memory. "But the access road washed out years ago. We'll have to go on foot through Devil's Canyon." Grandfather pressed his hand against his bleeding shoulder, crimson seeping between his fingers. "In this storm, through that terrain, it'll take hours. And if I'm bleeding this much from what should be a flesh wound—" Sam knelt beside Webb's motionless form, checking for the pulse his grandfather had taught him to find on injured cattle. Nothing. He looked up at the 2 adults who were depending on him to be stronger than any 8-year-old should have to be. "Then we split up," Sam said with startling calm. "Eleanor knows where the women are. I know this ranch better than anyone, and you know how to contact people who can help." "Absolutely not." Grandfather's voice carried parental authority even as his face grew paler. "I'm not sending you into that storm alone." "You're not sending me," Sam replied, already moving toward Webb's fallen flashlight. "I'm going. Jenny Morrison has been trapped for weeks. The others have been there for years. Every minute we argue is another minute they think no one's coming." Eleanor stepped forward, testing her balance on legs that remembered freedom. "The boy's right, Henry, and there's something else. If Webb doesn't report back to whoever else is involved in this operation, they're going to come looking. We need those women moved before dawn." The truth of it settled over them like the storm's weight. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a race against time with stakes that went beyond 7 imprisoned women. If Webb had partners, if there were others who expected reports or shared his twisted sense of justice, then tonight represented their only window of opportunity. Grandfather pulled out his service radio, its static crackling with interference from the storm. "Sheriff's frequency still works. I can call in federal marshals, tell them we've uncovered a kidnapping ring. But they'll need coordinates, evidence, survivors to interview. Which means someone has to reach those women first," Sam said, checking Webb's pockets until he found a heavy ring of keys. "Someone has to tell them help is coming and get them ready to move." Eleanor knelt down until she was eye level with Sam, her face serious in the wavering flashlight beam. "Listen to me carefully. The mine entrance is hidden behind a rockfall that looks natural but isn't. There's a gap just wide enough for one person, about shoulder height on the left side. Inside, follow the main tunnel for maybe 200 yards, until you reach a junction. Take the left fork. It drops down to where Henry built the holding area." "Holding area," Sam repeated, memorizing every detail. "Left fork, 200 yards. The women will be frightened," Eleanor continued. "They've been told for years that any rescue attempt would result in their deaths. You'll have to convince them you're real, that this isn't some kind of test or trap." Grandfather struggled to his feet, his face set with grim determination despite his wound. "Take this." He pressed his badge into Sam's small hand, the metal warm from decades of honest service. "Show them this. Tell them Sheriff Carter sent you. They'll know what it means." Sam stared down at the badge, its weight far heavier than mere metal and tin. This wasn't just a piece of law enforcement equipment. It was his grandfather's attempt at redemption, a symbol of the man he'd been before fear and twisted logic led him down a path of justified imprisonment. "What if they don't believe me?" Sam asked. "What if they're too scared to move?" Eleanor's eyes hardened with 20 years of accumulated fury. "Then you tell them that Eleanor Carter is free, that the chains are broken and the nightmare is ending. You tell them their families have never stopped looking, never stopped hoping." Above them, thunder crashed with renewed violence, but Sam no longer heard it as a threat. The storm that had seemed like an enemy was now their ally, covering their movements, washing away tracks, giving them darkness to work within. "We meet back here at dawn," Grandfather said, his voice carrying the weight of command despite his weakening condition. "Federal marshals will be here by then, and we'll have enough evidence to bury this thing so deep it never sees daylight again." Sam pocketed the badge and keys, Webb's flashlight heavy in his other hand. At 8 years old, he was about to undertake a rescue mission that would challenge experienced adults. But as he looked at Eleanor's tear-streaked face and his grandfather's determined expression, Sam realized something profound. Courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about choosing to act despite the fear. "Time to go," Sam said simply, and headed for the cellar stairs. The storm hit Sam like a living thing the moment he stepped outside, wind and rain lashing against him with such ferocity that he had to grip the barn door to keep from being knocked flat. Lightning illuminated the ranch in stark, violent snapshots, familiar buildings transformed into alien shapes by shadow and fury. He pulled his hat low and started north toward Devil's Canyon, each step a battle against mud that seemed determined to swallow his boots whole. The flashlight beam cut only a few feet through the torrential darkness, but Sam had walked this land since he could barely toddle. Storm or no storm, he knew every fence post, every gully, every shortcut that could shave precious minutes off his journey. The badge burned against his chest through his shirt pocket, a constant reminder of the weight he carried. 7 women were depending on him. Jenny Morrison, who'd been missing for weeks while the whole town searched. 6 others whose families had grieved them as dead, never knowing they were alive and suffering in underground darkness. As he reached the first rise, Sam glanced back at the barn one last time. Through the rain, he could see the faint glow of Eleanor and Grandfather's flashlights as they worked to secure Webb's body and prepare their own evidence. His grandfather was bleeding, possibly dying, but still doing his job, finally doing his job the way a sheriff was supposed to. The realization hit Sam like physical pain. He might never see his grandfather alive again. The man who'd raised him, taught him to ride, told him stories about frontier justice and doing what was right. That man might not survive the night, and here was Sam walking away from him into a storm, carrying the burden of saving lives that belonged to adults, to federal marshals, to anyone but an 8-year-old boy. But that was the sacrifice, wasn't it? The thing he had to give up. His childhood ended the moment he found Eleanor chained in that cellar. There was no going back to being just a curious ranch boy who got into harmless trouble. He'd seen too much, learned too much about the darkness that could hide behind familiar faces, even if everyone survived tonight. Even if all 7 women went free, Sam would never again have the luxury of believing that good and evil wore different faces. The wind howled through Devil's Canyon like the voices of the damned, and Sam had to brace himself against rocks worn smooth by centuries of flash floods. The mine entrance should be just ahead, hidden behind what Eleanor called a false rockfall. But in this darkness, with rain turning every surface treacherous, finding a concealed gap would be like looking for a specific star in a clouded sky. Lightning split the night again, and in that brilliant instant, Sam saw it. An unnatural arrangement of boulders that looked random but felt deliberate. He stumbled toward it, hands searching along wet stone until his fingers found empty space where there should have been rock. The gap was exactly where Eleanor said it would be, just wide enough for one person, positioned at his shoulder height. Sam squeezed through, scraping his back on rough stone, and emerged into absolute darkness that his flashlight barely dented. The tunnel stretched ahead like a throat waiting to swallow him whole, but Sam could hear something that made his heart race with desperate hope. Voices, faint, distant, but unmistakably human. Women talking in low tones, the sound carrying through stone corridors like prayers whispered in a cathedral. He followed Eleanor's directions, counting his steps, watching for the junction she'd described. 200 yards felt like 2 miles in the suffocating darkness, but finally his flashlight beam revealed the branching tunnels. Left fork, she'd said, the path that drops down to where his grandfather had built his elaborate prison. As Sam descended the sloping tunnel, the voices grew clearer. He could make out individual words now, conversations about home, about families, about whether anyone was still looking for them. The sound was heartbreaking in its normalcy, these women maintaining their humanity despite years of imprisonment. But he also heard something else that chilled him, footsteps that weren't his own, echoing from somewhere deeper in the mind system. Heavy boots moving with purpose through corridors that should have been empty except for prisoners. Sam froze, flashlight beam wavering as the terrible truth crashed over him. Webb hadn't been working alone. Someone else was down here. Someone who might already know that the operation was compromised, that the careful balance of 20 years was finally crumbling. The voices ahead fell silent, and Sam realized his own light had been visible to whoever was moving through the tunnels. He was no longer just a rescuer racing against time. He was a small boy with a flashlight, walking into a trap that could spring shut at any moment. But Jenny Morrison was down there. 6 other women were down there. And Sam Carter had made a promise that victory required keeping, no matter what it cost him. He clicked off his flashlight and continued forward in absolute darkness, guided only by memory and desperate courage. The darkness pressed against Sam like a living thing, but he forced himself to move forward, one careful step at a time. The heavy footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt worse than when they'd been moving. Whoever else was down here was listening now, waiting, planning. Sam's fingers found the tunnel wall, and he used it as a guide, sliding his boots along the rough stone floor to avoid making noise. The voices ahead had resumed, whispered conversations that spoke of hope and fear in equal measure. He was close now, close enough to hear individual words about rescue, about whether the sounds they'd heard meant freedom or fresh torment. A beam of light suddenly blazed through the darkness ahead, and Sam pressed himself against the tunnel wall as a gravelly voice echoed off the stones. "Ladies, we've got ourselves a situation tonight." The voice carried authority mixed with barely controlled panic. "Seems someone's been poking around where they shouldn't. Time to relocate." "Please," came a woman's voice, young, desperate. "Jenny Morrison. We haven't done anything wrong. We've been quiet. We've followed every rule. Rules changed an hour ago when my partner stopped answering his radio. Heavy boots approached the holding area. Now we move fast and quiet, or things get real unpleasant real quick." Sam's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the scope of the trap they'd walked into. This wasn't just Webb and his grandfather. There was an entire network, people who communicated by radio, who had contingency plans for exactly this scenario. His 8-year-old mind struggled to process the implications as he crept closer to where the tunnel opened into what must be the underground prison. The scene that greeted him was worse than anything Eleanor's descriptions had prepared him for. 7 women sat chained to metal posts, driven deep into the mine floor, their clothes clean but worn, their faces gaunt despite obvious attempts to keep them fed. The man standing over them wore a deputy's uniform that Sam recognized from town. Deputy Marshal Tucker, who helped search for Jenny Morrison, who'd comforted her family, who'd been part of the conspiracy all along. Sam's hand closed around his grandfather's badge, and suddenly he understood what needed to happen. This wasn't about stealth anymore. This was about bearing witness, about making sure the truth got told no matter what happened to him. He stepped into the circle of lantern light, flashlight raised like a weapon. "Deputy Tucker," Sam said, his voice carrying across the cavern with surprising steadiness. "Sheriff Carter sent me to tell you the operation's over." Tucker spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before stopping as he registered Sam's age. "Jesus Christ, kid, what the hell are you doing down here?" "My job," Sam replied, pulling out his grandfather's badge and holding it where the lantern light caught the metal. "Sheriff Carter's been shot. Webb's dead. Federal marshals are already on their way." The women stared at Sam with expressions ranging from disbelief to desperate hope. Jenny Morrison's eyes filled with tears as she recognized him, the ranch boy who'd been part of the search parties, who'd sat in her family's kitchen while the adults planned their futile efforts. "You're lying," Tucker said, but his voice carried doubt now. Henry would never compromise the operation. Too much at stake. 20 years of stakes, Sam agreed, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. 20 years of telling himself he was protecting these women instead of imprisoning them. But tonight he remembered what protection actually means. Tucker's radio crackled to life, static-filled voices reporting federal vehicles on the main highway, emergency frequencies lighting up across 3 counties. The deputy's face went white as he realized his world was crumbling in real time. "Doesn't matter," Tucker said, drawing his weapon with the desperate resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. "Operation's blown, but loose ends still need cutting. Starting with you, boy." The gunshot that followed didn't come from Tucker's weapon. Sheriff Henry Carter stood in the tunnel entrance, smoking revolver in his blood-stained hand, his face carved from granite and shadow. Tucker crumpled without a sound, his unfired weapon clattering across stone. "Sam," grandfather said quietly, his voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than physical wounds. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir," Sam replied, moving immediately toward the chained women. "But they need medical attention. Some of them have been here for years." As Sam worked with his grandfather's keys to unlock the first set of chains, the magnitude of what they'd accomplished began to settle over the cavern. 7 women who'd been mourned as dead were about to walk free. A conspiracy that had poisoned 2 decades was finally exposed. The nightmare that had transformed Sam from boy to something harder was ending. But victory carried its own weight. As Jenny Morrison collapsed into tears of relief and the other women whispered prayers of gratitude, Sam realized he'd lost something in this underground darkness that he'd never get back. The world had revealed its capacity for monstrous complexity, and that knowledge would follow him forever. The badge in his pocket felt heavier than ever as sirens began echoing down from the surface. The federal marshals reached them first, their voices booming through the tunnels like salvation made audible. Sam helped Jenny Morrison to her feet as uniformed men flooded the chamber, their faces grim with professional purpose that couldn't quite mask their horror at what they'd discovered. "Son, you need to step back now," Marshal Davidson said gently, placing a hand on Sam's shoulder. "Let the medics take over." But Sam couldn't let go of Jenny's hand. She was real, she was free, and releasing her felt like allowing the nightmare to return. Only when she squeezed his fingers and whispered, "Thank you," did he finally step away and let the adults reclaim the rescue he'd made possible. The journey back to the surface passed in a blur of emergency lights and radio chatter. Sam walked beside his grandfather's stretcher, watching paramedics work to stabilize wounds that looked worse in proper lighting. Eleanor rode in the same ambulance, her hand never leaving grandfather's arm, 20 years of separation compressed into every touch. Dawn broke over the Carter Ranch like forgiveness itself, golden light washing away the storm's fury and revealing a world that looked exactly the same but felt fundamentally different. Sam stood on the hospital porch hours later, still wearing his muddy clothes, still carrying his grandfather's badge, watching as news crews descended on their quiet Montana town like locusts drawn to tragedy. "Samuel Carter?" A woman in a pressed suit approached him. notepad ready. "I'm with the Helena Tribune. Can you tell our readers how it feels to be a hero?" Sam stared at her for a long moment, then walked inside without answering. Heroes were supposed to feel victorious, weren't they? They weren't supposed to carry the weight of watching their grandfathers kill men in underground tunnels, or knowing that the safe world of childhood was gone forever. In the hospital room, Grandfather lay propped against white pillows, his face pale but alert. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand in his, both of them looking older than their years, but somehow more themselves than Sam had ever seen them. "How are you feeling?" Sam asked, settling into the chair by the window. "Like a man who spent 20 years making the wrong choices," Grandfather replied quietly. "But grateful to have the chance to make different ones." Eleanor looked up at Sam, her eyes still carrying traces of the fear that had lived in them so long. "The other women want to thank you personally, when they're stronger, when the doctors say they're ready." "I'd like that," Sam said, and meant it. But he also knew those meetings would be complicated, shadowed by questions about why it had taken an 8-year-old boy to accomplish what law enforcement had failed to do for decades. "Sam," Grandfather said, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. "What happened down there? What you saw, what you had to do, that's not a burden any child should carry. But you carried it anyway, and that makes you stronger than most grown men I've known." "Doesn't feel like strength," Sam admitted. "Feels like everything's different now. Like I can't go back to being just a kid who gets into trouble exploring." "No," Eleanor said softly, "you can't. But that doesn't mean what you've become is wrong. You've seen the worst people can do to each other, but you've also seen what courage looks like when it matters most." Through the window, Sam could see the town spreading below them. The same streets he'd walked his whole life, the same buildings, the same mountains in the distance. But he knew now that darkness could hide behind the most familiar faces, that evil wore badges and uniforms and carried the authority of law. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Jenny Morrison stood in the doorway, her mother beside her, both of them looking uncertain but determined. Jenny had been cleaned up, given fresh clothes, but her eyes still held the haunted quality of someone who'd seen too much. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "Mom told me you never stopped looking." Sam stood up, suddenly feeling the awkwardness of his age again. "I'm just glad you're safe." "We all are," Jenny's mother added, tears streaming down her face. "All 7 families owe you a debt we can never repay." But as they talked, as other families began arriving to express their gratitude, Sam realized something important. He didn't want their debt. He didn't want to be the boy hero who saved 7 women from underground imprisonment. He wanted to be Sam Carter, 8 years old, curious about the world but not responsible for fixing all its broken places. That boy was gone forever, though. In his place stood someone older in ways that couldn't be measured in years. Someone who understood that real courage meant acting despite fear, that justice sometimes required terrible choices, and that the price of doing right could be the loss of innocence itself. As evening fell over the hospital, Sam sat with his grandfather and grandmother, finally, truly together for the first time in his memory. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of good and evil, but in this room, healing had begun, the new beginning. 3 months later, Sam Carter stood at the edge of Devil's Canyon, watching the autumn wind scatter golden leaves across stones that had once hidden unspeakable secrets. The mine entrance had been sealed with concrete and steel, marked with a federal warning sign that would keep curious explorers away. But Sam would always know what lay beneath, chambers where darkness had lived for 20 years before light finally found its way inside. The town had changed in ways both visible and hidden. Deputy Tucker's conspirators had been rooted out one by one, a network of corruption that reached deeper than anyone had imagined. 3 more officials, 2 businessmen, and a judge had faced federal charges. The trials would continue for months, but the machinery of justice ground forward with inevitable momentum. Jenny Morrison walked up beside him, her steps quiet on the canyon path. She came here sometimes too, she'd told him, not to remember the imprisonment, but to remind herself that even the deepest darkness could be overcome. "Mom's making apple pie," she said. "Asked if you wanted to come for dinner." "Maybe," Sam replied, though they both knew he would. The Morrison house had become a second home for him, a place where his transformed understanding of the world felt less isolating. Jenny's family understood what it meant to live after trauma, to rebuild normalcy from fragments. They walked back toward town together, past the Carter ranch where grandfather was slowly recovering. The bullet wounds had healed, but the deeper injuries would take longer. Some evenings, Sam found him sitting on the porch with Eleanor, both of them talking in low voices about memories they were finally free to share. Their love story had been interrupted by 20 years of imprisonment and guilt, but it continued now with the patience of people who understood the value of second chances. "The reporter came by again yesterday," Jenny mentioned as they reached the main road. "Still wanting to write a book about what happened." Sam grimaced. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. National news crews, magazine writers, publishers offering contracts for a story that belonged to an 8-year-old who just wanted to be left alone. His grandfather had handled most of it, politely but firmly explaining that some victories were too complicated for headlines. "What did you tell her?" "Same thing I always tell them. The story's not about being rescued, it's about learning to live afterward." Sam nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The rescue had been one night, but everything that followed was the real story, learning to sleep without nightmares, rebuilding trust in familiar faces, carrying knowledge that felt too heavy for their young shoulders. At school, Sam had become something of a legend among his classmates, but it was an isolating kind of fame. Other kids looked at him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, as if he returned from some foreign country where the rules were different. In many ways, he had. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had been the most helpful adult in navigating this strange new reality. She'd quietly rearranged his schedule to give him breaks when the attention became too much, assigned him research projects that challenged his obviously accelerated understanding of justice and moral complexity. She treated him like the child he still was while acknowledging the adult experiences he carried. The Morrison house glowed with warm light as they approached, and Sam could smell cinnamon and nutmeg drifting from the kitchen windows. Mr. Morrison waved from the garden where he was burning the last of the autumn leaves, his face carrying the deep contentment of a man whose prayers had been answered. Inside, the dinner conversation flowed around topics both ordinary and profound. Jenny's little brother chattered about his school play. Mrs. Morrison shared gossip from the ladies' auxiliary meeting. Mr. Morrison discussed plans for expanding his hardware store, but underneath the normalcy ran currents of deeper meaning, a family savoring the simple miracle of being together. After pie and coffee, as Sam prepared to walk home in the gathering darkness, Mrs. Morrison pulled him aside. "I know the adults keep saying this," she said quietly, "but I need you to understand something. What you did, it wasn't just brave, it was necessary. Without you, those women would still be down there. Our family would still be broken." Sam nodded, accepting the weight of her gratitude without the discomfort he'd once felt. He'd learned to carry appreciation along with everything else, another part of the person he'd become. The walk home took him past the sheriff's office, where a new deputy worked the evening shift. Grandfather would return to his duties eventually, but federal oversight would continue indefinitely. Trust, once broken, required years to rebuild. At the ranch, Sam found his grandfather and Eleanor sitting by the fireplace, her head resting against his shoulder as they read together from the same book. They looked up as he entered, their faces reflecting the deep peace of people who'd survived their worst fears and found love waiting on the other side. "Good evening?" Grandfather asked. "Yes, sir," Sam replied, settling into his favorite chair. "A very good evening." Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of coming winter across land that had seen both terrible secrets and terrible courage. In this warm room, surrounded by family that had been lost and found again, Sam Carter felt something he'd thought was gone forever, the simple contentment of being exactly where he belonged. The boy who'd broken into that barn 3 months ago was gone, but the person he'd become was learning, finally, to be at peace.